and I'm also co-director of the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice, which is an interdisciplinary center with projects across campus. One of our emphases is human rights archives, which means that we're engaged in the collection, processing, researching in, and digitization of various types of archives, from the archives kept by the National Police of Guatemala to the papers of human rights activists like those we'll talk about today. So the project from which this roundtable stems involves the papers of Frances T. Sissy Farenthold, who I'm thrilled to say is right here. And also with us for the roundtable are Ruth Mojica Hamer, who some of you might have known as Rhea Hamer, who's a contemporary of Sissy, and you're going to get to clap in a moment for each of them, and my colleague Susan Richardson, who has into the introduction to the roundtable. And then Susan has a PowerPoint that we're going to weave in with a discussion with Ruth and Sissy. So, around 40 years ago, in the early 1970s, Sissy donated her papers to what was then called the Center for American History at the University of Texas. As a 1949 graduate of UT Law School, Sissy had reason to give the papers to her alma mater, and we're very happy about that. And by the time that she donated them in the early 70s, she had accomplished much, enough to warrant significant interest in collecting the papers. So in a span of 5 incredible years, Sissy had moved from a job as director of legal aid in South Texas to a figure of national prominence. From 1968 to 72, she had served in the Texas legislature, and while in the legislature, she was the only woman in the House. And she worked on a number of progressive causes, and I'll just name a few, from voting rights for Mexican Americans and the protection of the conservation of Texas beaches, to the Equal Rights Amendment, which she co-sponsored along with Barbara Jordan, who was the only woman in the Texas Senate at the time, and which Texas passed. She became best known in the legislature, perhaps, though, for her involvement in the Dirty 30. And some of you might know about that. It was a group of 30 lawmakers who were progressive Democrats as well as a few Republicans. And just a reminder, there were very few Republicans in Texas in those years. And they worked together to use House rules to get a resolution on the table that called for investigation into the roles played by the Texas House Speaker and other legislators that went pretty high up into a bribery scandal. And many of those people were not reelected. And when you tune in at the end of the day to our project, which is putting together a website and a number and film footage, including this, with Sissy and people she worked with, you can find out more about sort of the revisiting of the Dirty 30 and a terrific event that Susan organized. And I'm sure Sissy would be happy to talk about that if there are questions. But soon thereafter, Sissy made a successful bid for the Democratic, a near successful bid for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination in Texas against Dolph Briscoe. They were in a runoff. He did later become governor, and it's worth noting that he eventually donated money to UT to rename the Center for American History the Briscoe Center. So our project, and this is a pilot project from it that was focused on some work that Sissy did later in her career, has on the banner, right, the Rappaport Center and Briscoe Center. But Sissy says some people just have to be above such things as she is. Across the nation, people followed Sissy's gubernatorial campaign. And at the 1972 National Democratic Convention, Gloria Steinem, as part of her work with the National Women's Political Caucus that had been founded in 1971, nominated Sissy from the floor to be McGovern's vice president. That made Sissy the first serious and third ever female nominee to be the Democratic candidate for that position. She garnered over 400 votes and came in second, and many, many people were galvanized in the process. So Sissy's prominence was evidenced, and I have to say that here, by many things, but one was the honorary degree she received from Boston University in 1973, which she received alongside Octavio Paz and Tip O'Neill. And I think she has been here once since then, but she was there at graduation with that honorary degree. She has many of her own degrees, but that one included. And when the National Women's Political Caucus had its first convention in 1973, Sissy was elected its first chair. Now remember, that all happened in 5 years. Sissy's continued to do a lot and to add papers to the archives, which cover many remarkable aspects of her life, from her stint as the first female president of Wells College, her work in the women's peace movement. She chaired the peace tent at the 1985 NGO Forum in Nairobi, which is much of what we looked at in the website we've put together already. Her human rights work in the United States and abroad on issues of racial, gender, economic, and political justice. And just in terms of her activity, this is the third talk she's given in 4 days in 3 different cities. Now, when Sissy was elected chair of the caucus, another Texan-born politician, Ruth, who went by Mojica was elected vice chair. Now, Ruth had moved to Illinois sometime earlier, where she had a television program entitled Ayuda in Chicago. In 1972, she had been the first Mexican-American woman to run for U.S. Congress. And she came to the convention in 1973 and spoke on a panel about running for office that she'll tell us about in a few minutes. And although Ruth did not win that election, she stayed involved in electoral politics and 4 years later managed the successful campaign of the first Latina elected to public office in Illinois. Ruth, too, has remained an activist all her life, and for those of you who were at the panel on Chicana feminism before this, heard a lot about it. But just to give you a bit more, she's founding member of the National Latino Media Coalition, the Mexican American Business and Professional Women's Club of Chicago, and the Mexican American Political Organization of Illinois. President Jimmy Carter appointed her to the Commission for the National Women's Conference, which was part of the International Women's Year celebration held in Houston in 1977. And again, you'll hear a lot more about that in a bit. Now, it's largely been the work of Susan Richardson, over to my right, although not politically, that has brought us all to this round table, not to my left either.
Yes, very much to your left.
That's brought us all to this round table today. She'll be seated at Sissy's left in a bit. Susan's a gifted journalist who for the past 25 years has written about social justice and human rights issues. 6 months ago, she became the publisher and editor of the Chicago Reporter. But for the past year and a half, she has been a research fellow at the Rappaport Center and director of a grant we received to work on Sissy's archives. Susan also brings years of activism to the project. Since before becoming a journalist, she was an organizer with the African Liberation Support Committee, which worked to build political links and material support between the liberation movements of people of African descent in the US and Africa. And she also worked with grassroots organizations across the South and rank and file trade union movements throughout the Texas Gulf Coast. And she was actually a reporter in Corpus Christi, where Sissy grew up and represented the area she represented in the legislature, although not at the same time. Yeah. Now, when Susan was working in Sissy's papers one day, and she spent a lot of time going through the archive, she came across the National Women's Political Caucus's statement of purpose and was really taken by it. So as you know, or we'll find out more about, the National Women's Political Caucus was founded to train and elect women to run for political office, but it had broader political aims than we at first realized, perhaps. So Susan and I were particularly taken by the statement because it seemed so much more radical than anything we would see today, and even that we had seen for some time. So the purpose of the roundtable is to share that history with you, to turn to the history with some of its participants, and perhaps with 2 aims in mind at least. So I'll tell you the two that we have in mind. So part of working with this and other archives, we are sometimes overtaken by what Jacques Derrida has referred to as archive fever. But we do that not to search for origins, and Derrida was very critical of institutional archives that search for the answer, the origin. We don't do it for that. Really and maybe I'll just speak for me here, the archive in this project offers a chance to reflect on why we so often turn to history. So why are we all here fascinated about looking back? And I find it useful when feeling stuck in certain political moments and even in certain political movements and desperately in need of new or alternative political imaginaries to look to the past. To look for alternatives that might have been, maybe sometimes that were, but to consider how and why some of those also failed, and in learning that, maybe to better understand the present. But of course, when we do that, I say this about comparison, the grass is always greener on the other side, because you don't see all of the difficulties sometimes. So the grass is always greener on the other side of now, maybe. Maybe the future, but if not the future, certainly at times the past. So the second aim is that the archive and our ongoing re-engagement with and building of it, like what we're doing here, we're adding to the archive, both virtually, figuratively maybe, and literally, because this will become a part of the archive, and Sissy's papers and others as well, offers a corrective to perhaps our over-romanticization of the past. So maybe it wasn't as easy, even if they didn't have to deal with all this technology as we think. So some questions are, do we miss maybe the hard work of coalition politics? Do we miss what might have been left out or what voices might have been suppressed? Do we imagine that things were more planned and thought through than they might have been? And for that, I'm going to turn, the last thing before turning it over to Susan, to a quote from Sissy that was quoted in a 1975 Harvard Crimson article, because in 1975, the National Women's Political Caucus had its meeting here in Boston. And that, of course, was when Sissy was chair and turning it over. But the Harvard Crimson covered it in an article called Wine, Women, and Throngs. So we won't go into that. But here's how the article starts. Athena had an advantage over us. Sissy Farenthold, chair of the Women's National Political Caucus, and then, well, I'm going to tell you what the reporter wrote. Sucked the convention members into her words like a pagan priestess mesmerizing a pack of willing iconoclasts. But the point for our purposes right now is Athena had an advantage. She sprang full grown from the forehead of Zeus. Our movement, Sissy said, quote, is not ordained from on high, and we hardly sprang full grown. Our growth will come with painstaking effort. And so this roundtable is a chance to look back at some of that painstaking effort. And with that, I turn to Susan.
Okay. Wonderful introduction. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm so glad to be here. I just want to say a couple of quick things just to piggyback on what Karen was saying. And one thing was just said in the panel discussion earlier by Martha Cotera. As we talked, I have two connections. I'm both a Texan and I live in Chicago. So it was magical when I met Ruth and her daughter Linda, because I already knew Mrs. Cotera from being a columnist in Austin. So my life came full circle around this project, and it brought me together with these two women. One I've known for a very long time and admired. And then it was a pleasure to meet Ruth and find out about her activism. But of course, I saw her name for the first time in the archives as I was doing the research on the history of the National Women's Political Caucus. And coming to a point that we discussed earlier and that was discussed in the previous panel, and to kind of just add to what Karen said, if we don't have a common narrative, if we don't have a common history, we don't have a common narrative. And one thing you begin to see through looking at documents and archives is that there's so many stories that don't get to be part of what us journalists call the first take of history. And if they're not getting in there, then they're not becoming a part of the record. So these archives really do much to help correct the historic record, and they move us toward having a common narrative. And when we talk about building just societies, you know, often what happens is you hide the records. You don't have the records. And so much of the human rights work that's done at the Rappaport Center is about being able to document. Because then, yes, it's proof. It happened. It happened this way. Here are the voices that may not have been recorded into, you know, mainstream history. So it was amazing to go through the archives and find things. So today we're here to talk about the Statement of Purpose, which was adopted at the first gathering of the National Women's Political Caucus in July 1971. And as Karen has said, and as our topic is today, it was amazingly progressive. In the context of the 1960s and 70s, of course, it was, in many ways, exactly in the spirit of the times. You had both a women's movement, but you also had broad-based social justice movements, and what we see reflected in this statement is a bringing together of those. So there's a piece that you can't see at the bottom that we wanted to highlight for you, so I'm just going to read it to you. And this is the essence of the statement. We believe that women must take action to unite against sexism, racism, institutional violence, and poverty. And that's wow. Let me tell you a little bit about the NWPC before I kind of go and talk a little bit more about that statement. So in July 1971, more than 300 women, in a very, I'm told, unorganized way, gathered in Washington, D.C. to create the caucus. While we've just talked about a very visionary statement, the very specific goal of the group was to train and elect women to office. And the founders were an extremely diverse and bipartisan group, although when I look at it in hindsight, I realize Angela Davis wasn't there. So we'll talk about, though, within a political spectrum, both Republican and Democratic women at that time. Myrlie Evers, the widow of the slain civil rights leader, Liz Carpenter, former press secretary for Lady Bird Johnson, Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, Beulah Sanders, who along with Johnny Tillman, I've rushed ahead, were members of the National Welfare Rights Organization, LaDonna Harris, a Native American activist, and Gloria Steinem. And just to refresh memories, here is Beulah Sanders with Johnny Tillman and George Wiley, all of the National Welfare Rights Organization, at the 1968 Democratic Convention. And then, of course, here is Sissy with Bella Abzug, LaDonna Harris, just to show you a few of the founders. So our premise here is that this statement of purpose was progressive in its understanding of this intersection of gender, race, and class, and the need, as I said earlier, to find common cause with other social justice movements. So we recently interviewed Gloria Steinem, and here is what she said about the statement. Of course, she was one of the women who were in Washington, D.C. and helped to
had a very
draft.
good statement of purpose.
Yeah.
I'm proud still of the statement of purpose, and not without cost, you know, because there were some women who really felt that putting such issues in the platform, you know, would detract from our approval because of the war or because, I don't know, I mean, but I'm proud of that statement of purpose, which actually some of it was written in this living room by a ton of people. And we also used to pay each other's fares to get here so that people who couldn't afford to come could come and
See, this
help
is the
draft-
one what I
help-
missed out on.
help
you know.
draft it, you know, I mean, right. It was class conscious as well.
And that was Amy Goodman you saw at the end of that clip. Amy Goodman interviewed Sissy Farenthold and Gloria Steinem together in Steinem's apartment. So I'm going to let them sit back down. Thank you for moving. This is not the best setup. And I hope you could all hear what Gloria Steinem said. I know it was a little bit low, but her whole point was that she knew they would face, the group would face some pushback because different issues were being raised that weren't just issues about the ERA, but that, they thought that the statement was worth it and that it opened the door to discussions about class. So, Karen.
And about war, right?
And a number of issues. We'll talk about those in a minute.
So, in preparation for this, we asked a law student who works at the Rappaport Center to go through all of the legislative goals that the statement had. And were you going to go through those?
Well, I
think you were
thought
gonna go
that
through
we
those
would talk
first.
maybe about some of their thoughts on the statement, and then I can go
Before we
through
go
those.
into the
Yeah.
goals, right, thank you.
Yeah, because there's a lot of details.
Yeah, so, okay, I got it. So, did we pass around the statement?
No.
We had a
We
few
didn't.
copies of the statement, and so if you really want them, you can come get them or email us for them. But one of the things that was interesting is that, as Susan just said, in 1971, neither Ruth nor Sissy was at the founding, and yet they came in 1973 to the convention, and at some point they learned about the statement of purpose. And so we'd like to get each of you to reflect a little bit on what the statement of purpose, what resonated out of all the many issues, just one or two that really resonated for you. And we'll start with Sissy.
Okay, I had had a searing experience as legal aid director for New Oasis County, Corpus Christi, before I went to the legislature. So it had opened my eyes to many things that I had seen but hadn't really put together, and that was the abuse of women, the cost of poverty, the traps people in that they couldn't get out of. So I had gone to the legislature thinking that I could work on that subject. It never came about that it was possible. So the thing that really struck me about that statement, and I used it over and over again during my tenure there at the Caucus, was institutionalized violence. I had never put that together as a category. I hadn't ever questioned the military. Remember, I was growing up and a young adult at the end of World War II. And it was really what those wise people in Washington did, and you didn't really question it. So it was really the outset of my questioning the military and its uses. It was also a question I'd seen enough on the criminal justice system to know its failures, but using the term institutionalized violence, I put that too in that category. So I had a whole new category of thinking of related institutions that I hadn't thought of before. And that was the thing I always fell back on, because the other things, I hadn't lived it, but I had been exposed to things in the legal aid work I'd done. So institutionalized violence was really a touchstone for me for the future of my efforts.
Right, as seen in the work in the peace camps and
East
on
End
in the
and 80
future.
Nuke
Yeah.
and all of it.
Ruth, what about the statement resonated with you when you learned about it?
Muy buenas tardes, encantadas de estar con ustedes. Yes, indeed, she does speak English. And I'm sorry I didn't bring my press agent to give me an introduction to you about me, as Sissy got. I was born in Des Moines, Iowa, the first Mexican-American baby born in the Mercy Hospital of Des Moines, Iowa, because I was a cesarean section baby. The only little baby in the nursery with a full head of hair. All the little gringo babies were bald. When I was 2.5, my family moved to Chicago in Bridgeport, which later became Mayor Daley's bailiwick. And in 1970, I was working on the Spanish language program Ayuda at WCIU-TV. And then at CBS doing We Are Chicago when I ran for Congress, the first Hispanic woman to run for Congress in the state of Illinois. The question was, what was the question?
In the statement, what parts resonate for you?
What resonates for me? Okay, Not all of it. Here's some. We believe that women must take action to unite against sexism, racism, institutional violence, and poverty. And that to rally national and local support for the campaigns of women candidates, federal, state, and local, who declare themselves ready to fight for the rights and needs of women and all underrepresented groups. Insist that there be no token female representation, that women selected to give equal voice to women actually represent the views of these women, and not merely to echo the unacceptable views of men. I believe I have one more. No, two more. Form coalitions with other oppressed groups and all human groups which share the goals of fighting against racism, sexism, violence, and poverty. Comprehensive and preventative health care for all Americans. And that was it. That for me.
Okay, we'll come back to this in a second after you see a little bit more on the statement and what it says.
So let's talk about some of the 22 guidelines for issues. So there were a number of issues that were raised in the statement of purpose. And just first, some that you would expect. Support for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. Support for reproductive freedom for women. Support amending the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to end discrimination against women. Supporting an extension of the Equal Pay Act. Supporting an end to tax inequities affecting women and children. And relative to many of the things that Ruth was just talking about, several issues in the statement reflect this intersection of the women's movement and social justice movements of the time, from the opposition to the war in Vietnam to support for a guaranteed national income, which was the position of the National Welfare Rights Organization, which, as we know, came from, a lot of that position came from the work of Frances Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, who, of course, worked closely with George Wiley and Beulah Sanders and Johnny Tillman. But also just to drill down and look at a few more of these positions that really showed an attempt to intersect with broad social justice movements and why we were interested in this. The immediate withdrawal, and this is a direct quote, from Indochina, and a resolution that the U.S. will never again violate any nation's right of self-determination. Well, anyway. Oppose war, the arms race, and all forms of violence, which were considered a masculine form of conflict resolution, which we can have a real conversation about women who are now engaged in militarization. Oppose government surveillance of dissidents and the persecution of political prisoners. Remembering our times, you had, hundreds of people being thrown in jail and being spied on. We're in the period of COINTELPRO. We're also in the period where many people were rounded up and imprisoned or left the country because they were going to be prosecuted for their political activities. And support for universal health care, which we've heard that before. And then once again, coming back to the national welfare rights position, support for an adequate income for all Americans. At the time, what that meant and what the NWRO was calling for was $6,500 a month for a family of 4. And yes, so that was a long time ago. But that was considered what would be an adequate income, and was adopted and heavily organized. This was a big part of the plank of the National Welfare Rights Organization. And when Beulah Sanders and Johnny Tillman first became engaged with the organization, we see that it was actually written into, and the name, the National Welfare Rights Organization, is in the statement of purpose, which to me was also very, very surprising, because we're talking about poor women who were organizing themselves in an organization that had women across all sorts of class and racial lines. So it was very significant to see it there. So I want to pull back and maybe set up for some other questions that just kind of talk, though, about the function of the National Women's Political Caucus. So in looking through some of the material and finding this quote from Shirley Chisholm, and as we know, Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman to run for a nomination of president in a major political party at the 1972 Democratic National Convention. Sissy was nominated for vice president and came in second to Thomas Eagleton. Shirley Chisholm came into, the convention running a campaign, and she said, I ran for president. That's the position I wanted. I didn't get it. I'm not going to run for vice president. But she had the support of the National Women's Political Caucus. But I found this statement to be really interesting, and it kind of transitions us into a bit more of the history. So she's saying the function of the group is not to be the cutting edge of the women's liberation movement, but the big umbrella organization which provides the weight and muscle for those issues which the majority of women in this country see as concerns. One of the conversations we've had about this is, was the NWPC, was it just to be an organization, or when it set in on certain goals, did it then move away from the social movement aspects of its identity? So as we kind of move forward and look at some of the next questions, let's talk a little bit about, and Karen alluded to this earlier, about which goals were actually achieved. So when I talk about those 22 guidelines, which are, you don't want to hear all of them, but when we talk about some of those, we want to look back and just say, from a very strict organizational standpoint, what were some of the goals that were achieved?
And one of the things Sissy and I were talking about yesterday is in 1972, many of the things that were achieved, many of them were achieved in 1972 with legislation in the following year, and maybe not because of this statement, right? I mean, those were things that were on people's minds, and there was significant support for. And that's kind of interesting too, just going back and Susan and I talking about what was radical. Why is it that this seems so radical? So we did have a student go through to see when each of the items on the long list, and you got most but not all of them, were achieved if they were, and we were just sort of laughing because, as you were a moment ago in seeing the language about the war, about the end to war, right, there were many times when she wrote, not achieved, not achieved. As well as on the end to use of repressive measures against persons who are justly concerned about social change in the United States with wiretapping and whatnot, not achieved. It really sort of questioned for us, what was achievable and what wasn't achievable, and what seemed radical to you all at the time about the goals, and maybe what are you happiest about the achievements, and maybe what do you think is still, which of the ones that have not been achieved do you think are most important?
Well, of course, the whole thing about war and respecting self-determination, because I think we've moved disastrously on that issue to where it's almost, look at the wars we've had since then. And I think part of it was that we never really looked at the Vietnam War. We thought it was sort of something that happened. Well, no, it was one of a whole chain of events. And I think we've gone, so where is our peace movement? Where is trying to do something about the nukes? And let's not say they didn't, and either side would intentionally do it, of the two major powers that, well, the two big powers that have them, and I'm not speaking of the other ones, but what's to prevent the errors, the mistakes, the accidents? There's silence on it. I mean, we live in on such a precarious planet today. So I think we've gone backwards, actually, on that issue, on the issue of war. It's not to abolish war now, it's what's the next step, what's the new weapon. So I think that's been a very discouraging overall when you look from the 70s to now. And the militarization of the whole world. These special forces that we really don't know what they're doing or where they are. So I think we're in a much more precarious, even in the midst of in the past, in the Cold War. I think today we've passed that point.
Yeah, and just to say something about, Susan mentioned in the women's movement today, if we can talk about what that is, but, right, that a lot of feminists, we could say that too, but the focus is certainly not on war in the way that it was during those times.
No.
And Ruth, you had your activist roots actually in some anti-war efforts.
I was brought up a middle-class Mexican, and we did not call attention to ourselves with gossip and neighborhood stuff and all that. However, the boy that next door that I loved since I had memory, I had gone off to war. He volunteered for the submarines, the Navy, and then for the submarines. And I had a cousin who died in, a cousin who fought in the Battle of the Bulge. I don't forget how many missions in a B-17 bomber. And then his nephew, who was killed in Vietnam after returning from what do they call them, rest in something? I can't remember all that. I have a little bit of a memory lapse now that I'm in my upper years. And I heard that my white sisters from the suburbs were coming downtown to march for a moratorium in Vietnam. And I was doing television, and I had this beautiful fur coat, four-length for me. But I joined them because I had a 17-year-old nephew and a 15-year-old nephew, and I didn't want them to go to war. And so I joined them, and they gave me a doll baby with blood on it and on a stick, and to march in this thing, and I'm marching, and people are throwing eggs at us and cabbage and all kind of stuff. But I didn't care. I didn't care. And that was my first march, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and of course I should say the two other on the not achieved, passage of the ERA and repeal of all laws that affect a woman's right to decide her own reproductive and sexual life. And so I think that might be a segue back to you, Susan.
Yes, and what's happening right now, and especially in Texas, isn't it? So, I want to talk, there are 2 points of, other kind of points of context. These are numbers things, and I don't, depending on your politics, this matters or doesn't, but I think we all agree it has some value. Before I talk about the caucus, we also just, one of the things too in going through the history is you realize both for the Democratic National Convention in 1972 and the Republican Convention in 1972, there was a strong representation of women relative to the past because of the organizing efforts of the caucus. So going into both those conventions, the caucus had made a concerted effort to train women about procedure, but also because of the McGovern-Fraser Commission, which changed the rules for the 1972 Democratic Convention. It went from being this top-down process where the state party bosses chose the people to this more grassroots process. And one of the ironies of that is that one is Chicago, one is Sissy. The Sissy one is that even though she'd been an elected official, because of those rules, that was the first time she was able to go to a National Democratic Party convention, which just seems crazy, right? But it shows you basically that the white male leadership of the political parties weren't letting other voices have their say. The Chicago piece that comes out of the archive, and Ruth, this I find very interesting, is that since we're Chicagoans, or I am now, Jesse Jackson actually led the delegation from Illinois, and that meant that Richard Daley, the first Richard Daley, was not able to go. And then, of course, just to add one more level of context, of course, we remember in 1968 the violence that happened at the Democratic Political Convention there in Chicago. So you had 2 very different changes as a result of these rules, but the Democratic Party rules flowed from the violence at the 1968 Chicago Convention. So it changed the game. But there was the other element, and that's what the National Women's Political Caucus also did, was organize both with the Republican Party and the Democratic women in both parties to push for changes and ask for some form of parity. So you had the Steiger Commission was kind of the Republican version of the of the McGovern-Fraser Commission. And so in both parties, you saw an increase in the 72 convention of women in attendance. So, you know, that is an achievement. That is an achievement. So I want to just kind of walk back through a little more of the history of the caucus and then get to a couple of more issues that we want to talk to Ruth and Sissy about. So we know that the first, yes? No, sorry. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Can you not hear me, or okay, have I done something wrong? That's the teacher response, or the student response. Okay, so the first NWPC convention, we said that the statement, okay, it's coming back. Ah, here it is, it's back, okay. We said that the statement of purpose came from the 1971 gathering of women. So the first convention doesn't happen for, you know, about another 2 years. And in between 71 and 72, the organization operated pretty informally. Every 6 months, the co-chairs would rotate, right? So you had no permanent leadership. So by 1973, there were a number of issues to consider. So the caucus held its first convention in Houston at the Rice Hotel. I'll let them tell those stories, and those of you in the audience who were here. And as I said, it was almost 2 years after the organization was founded. One of the panels at this event had to do with, and coming off of the political campaigns in 1972, had to do with women running for office.
And Ruth was one of those women who had just been running for office as well. And you spoke at the convention on one of the first panels. And why don't you share with folks what you said on that panel?
When I ran for Congress, that was when I learned about the Chicano Caucus. And I kept hearing about Raza Primero and Partido Raza Unida, the United Race Party, and so forth. And I said to my campaign manager, what is all this about Partido Raza Unida and the Chicano movement and all that? So he, in the middle of, it was January, and he took me to South Bend where Dr. Julian Zamora had a class in Chicano studies, I think it was. And he was having a conference bringing in people from the Southwest on this new party. And I heard Bert Corona say, Bert Corona was from California, and he had an organization trying to help undocumented people. And I heard him say, the Republican Party is a party of rich people, and they don't even want to know about Mexicans and all that, okay? The Democratic Party lets us in their organization, and they let us vote, but we don't figure there. We're nobody there to them. Does that mean that we shouldn't part in a constitutionally guaranteed activity to participate in elections? No, but not there. Because the Republican and the Democratic Party are one animal with two heads and drink and eat out of the same trough. So we need a third party, Partido Raza Unida. And I said, yeah. And by then I lost my taste for winning in Congress and began to look for the Chicanos. And I found them in Michigan when one of them came to walk the streets with me, Juanita Gonzalez. In December in Chicago in the snow. And then later I went back, and then they were having something up there in Michigan. And that's when I met the rest of the Chicanas that were active in Michigan. Help me, somebody. The one who came to walk the streets with me? Jane Gonzalez. Okay, Jane Gonzalez was the first Mexican-American on the city council elected in the little suburb of Muskegon Heights. And they all had a police radio in their cars. And one day she came into the city council meeting and she says, you know, when the police talk about somebody driving under alcoholic influence, and it's in the white neighborhood, they say that they're inebriated. And when they talk about a Chicano in the Chicano neighborhood, and they're talking about, they say, he's drunk. Now, I move that they're all drunk or they're all inebriated. I mean, these women were talking my language, okay? And so I got involved with them, and then I went to the first convention of the National Partido Raza Unida. Help me, Miss Texas. Partido Raza Unida? Yes. The National Convention, okay. And because I had run for Congress, they had me running with Ramsey Muniz, who was running for governor on the Partido Raza Unida. And so I didn't participate too much in the activities. We paid, me and my significant other paid for the $500 to come to this thing, so that 7 from the Pilsen neighborhood here, the little bad Chicanos up there, could come too. And when we got there, they told us that we had to block vote, and they were going to vote for Corky. Well, Corky scared middle-class Mexicans, okay? We didn't want blood running in the streets. And so we told them no. Well, that we voted, and we're going to block vote. I said, then I'm going to the committee that certifies the people that are going to sit there and vote and all that. I said, and tell them that you owe 7/10 of $500 to pay to get in here, to us. And if you can't pay us right there, then you have to leave. So they changed their mind, and they let us vote for Corky, and of course, Corky won. Okay. And after that, and I was working with the Chicanas and everything, and what have you. So when we went to the first national convention of the NWPC, I went with them because, again, I was working in 2 places, making $500 a week. Lupe Anguiano asked me if I would pay for half of a suite so the Chicanas could have a headquarters in which to do all their thing. And I said, how much is that? She says, it's $200 a night, 3 nights. I said, so my part is $300? Yeah, I can do it. So she sent me the application to attend. And a week later, there's Liz Carpenter on the phone. Would I join the women who had run for office in an opening day panel entitled See How They Run? And I said, sure. So in the morning when I got up, there was a table like this on the stage and the microphone, and I looked, and there's Shirley Chisholm, Ebola Abzug, the Lieutenant Governor of New York, the Governor of Connecticut. And I thought, oh, what did I get into? What the heck? So I sat down about number 6 or 7, and they started to talk. And of course, they were talking magnificently. And I said to myself, oh, well, okay. And so when we got to the one next to me, which was either 5 or 6, I, who was doing television, picked up on the vibes in the room. They were repeating themselves, and the women were getting restless. So figuratively speaking, I took my remarks and threw them in the air. And then when I got up to speak, I said, my race for Congress was very much like the sisters that you heard before me. So much more eloquent than I'm capable of. So I'm not going to repeat what you've already heard. We were underfunded, we didn't have enough people, and what have you, and we didn't win. But while I was running, my daughter said to me, my 12-year-old daughter, Mommy, why are you doing this? And I said, let me see, I'm ready. When you grow up and you get your education, and you're out in the business world, and then you decide that you want to make a difference in government, and you want to run for office, and if we are successful with this National Women's Political Caucus, and I'm sure we will be, I can make you the same promises my white sisters have been making to their sons since the beginning of this country, and that is that you too may aspire to the White House. And I came home first vice chair of the National Women's Political Caucus.
And your daughter's in the White House. She didn't want to be there, but.
And now my daughter's telling these stories.
That's
She's
right.
the photographer that's in the back.
So, I found this brochure, actually, Susan found this brochure, of the National Women's Political Caucus from 1973, and incredible with what, to us, again, looking back, with what Ruth just said, I mean, in part that even though you joined La Raza Unida because of its critique of Republicans and Democrats, you nevertheless came to this National Women's Political Caucus, as did the Republicans and Democrats who didn't like each other either, generally.
But when I went there, I
and-
wasn't even a member of
Of the caucus.
you know, the
R-
caucus.
Right,
Yeah.
but I mean, but coming to the meeting,
Yeah, just,
right, with
just,
that.
just to pay
So-
for half the vote.
So,
Right.
so I mean, what I guess we're just sort of struck when you look. So, it's Sissy Farenthold, Democratic candidate. So it has. So when you look at the brochure, it says who the I think we have a
Yeah,
slide
who the
on this
officers
on
are,
who
right.
the officers
Yes.
were. So Audrey Colombe, they're in alphabetical order, Republican, from the Washington Research Project. She's African American. In 1975,
And a
became.
Republican.
No, that's what I just said, right? As a Republican, and in 1975, she became the chair. Then we have Rhea on here, and it says
I got
Ruth.
reelected.
It says La Raza Unida. Then Bobby Green Kilberg, Republican attorney, former White House fellow. Betsy Deerdorf, treasurer, Republican. And then Ann Lewis, Democrat. So of the 6 officers, 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 1 member of La Raza Unida. And that does seem pretty inconceivable to us today, especially that you all weren't there in 1971, but you supported and then became officers for an organization that had this platform that stood for so many things that we don't necessarily think of actually, well, especially the Republican Party
But Democrats
supporting
do.
now. And so we forget, exactly, and we forget that it was a Democrat who escalated the Vietnam War sometimes, right? And we also forget sometimes that Nixon actually supported the minimum income, which is something that's pretty inconceivable now. So I wonder if you all could talk about what it was like to work across the party lines inside the caucus. Were there tense moments on the basis of party affiliation?
In my first term, I was not asked to do anything from Ohio East, okay? So I invested my time in working with the Chicanas in the Southwest and what have you. For instance, helping Pauline Martinez to get the first Mexican-American woman elected to the state senate in Texas, since Texas had returned to the states after they were the Civil War, okay? Those were the things that out in Colorado, out in Nevada, wherever I was invited, but it was always bolstering the Chicanas from the Partido Raza Unida, okay? That's what I spent my time doing.
Oh, so that part of the division of labor
And
then
then
maybe
later
was
working
around.
with Rosemary when she was on the IWI.
Right,
Right.
later on.
So that
Um,
when I was appointed by Mr. Carter to the IWI thing, Rosemary was my secretary when we were behind the stage. And I remember to this day, I'm sitting there where the women that were going to be on the stage as the legal body of this organization. And this little Chicana that was one of the officers to make sure that anybody that didn't belong in that role wasn't there. And she comes up to me, she says, "You're sitting in the wrong section." And I said, "No, I'm not, honey, I'm a commissioner." And she said, "You're what?" I said, "Here's my badge." Then she let me stay. They weren't used to seeing Mexicans in those high places.
Well, and before we get to the IWI, I mean, the idea that so that was an appointment by Carter, but in the years in which you all were officers of the National Women's Political Caucus, Richard Nixon was the president.
That's right.
So maybe, Sissy, could you talk about how that played
No,
out?
well, it was a different time. There was something called the Ripon Society, and I think the Republican, the young women that were of that notion, let's say, and I found them wonderful to work with, totally dedicated. The ones that are listed there. Jill Ruckelshaus was another, who later was in the White House, and I'll tell that story. But there just wasn't a division, nothing like today. On the particular issues, we worked together. Now, I had coming out of Texas, we only had one party there at the time, which was the Democratic Party, but it was split. There was a conservative Bourbon ones, we call them, that always voted for the Republican president, but kept control of the Democratic Party on the local level. And then there was the liberal faction headed by Ralph Yarber during my time as the senator. And so within the party, we had such a split that it was like two parties in a sense. So the people that I worked with on the whole reform movement in the legislature, it included new Republican members who were, let's say, reformists in their way. And so until the impeachment thing came up, there wasn't any question of conflict in the caucus, as from my memory. I made a point, because I was on to impeachment early on with the Watergate deal. I did not bring it up because I wanted us to keep those Republican officers. They were so valuable to that. And I didn't I used to criticize institutional reasons, but I lived an institutional reason in not bringing that issue up early on. Sometime after, maybe early '74 or something, I was interviewed, and I, at that point, said, well, I think the issue of impeachment should be brought up. I said that one morning, maybe to AP, in Houston. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I have a phone call from the White House, which I'm not accustomed to. It was Jill Ruckelshaus saying, what did you say about impeachment? It goes that fast. Well, as I said, I just said it should be considered or brought up, discussed, whatever weasel words. But I found working with the Republicans that I worked with, both in the legislature, now times change, and one of our Dirty 30 people was a really questionable speaker for a long time. But, institutions will take you over. And so I had no problems. And I used to say at times, if I was living someplace else, I might have been a Republican at that time. I'd never say that today. But Lindsay, attractive, environmental person, so on and so forth.
Wow. Well, let's go back over, there were a couple of other issues that have come up in the conversation. So let's just kind of jump ahead, because I think there are some issues that came up at this convention that speak to some of what you're saying about, the nature of the women's movement today. But another thing that we found so interesting about the convention, and it starts with this, I believe, is Joe Freeman is still here? Yes? No? Okay. Anyway, this is one of the issues that was happening at the time of the convention was the Ferris strike. And just the very shorthand on the Ferris strike, in 1972, 4,000 garment workers at this fair manufacturing company in El Paso went on strike for the right to, or walked out for the right to organize. 85%, roughly 85% of the workers were Latinas. So this became not just a story in Texas, but it became a national story. And women around, or there was an organizing effort around the country to support these women and their right to organize, which by 1974 they finally won. But in the course of this 2-year campaign, FARA goes from being the #1 employer in El Paso to, having very, very few, which was the product of all the struggle that happened. So this issue, kind of in line with the big umbrella that Shirley Chisholm talked about, this issue was an issue that was raised by the caucuses at the convention. So one thing, just to kind of back up a little bit on this point, one of the interesting things too about this 73 convention is that you had multiple workshops and you had caucuses. And you saw that women of color were heavily represented in the caucuses. There was a Puerto Rican Women's Caucus, there was a Chicana caucus, you see here there was a Union Women Workshop, and there was a Black caucus. So from the caucuses, you had a lot of the issues that were embedded in the original statement of purpose. Many of these resolutions that the caucuses brought forward had to do with that, coming back to the core issues in the statement about sexism, racism, institutional violence, and ending poverty. So we're focusing on this one in particular because there were many from the Chicana caucus, because this was the one that really pushed the caucus, and the caucus responded well to support for these women who were trying to organize. And the resolution, just to read just a little bit of it, for the past 10 months, our Chicana sisters at FARA in Texas and New Mexico have been on strike to win their right to union representation and some measure of control over their working lives. Let us therefore reach out. But the key thing that jumped out for me in this resolution, reach out our hands to these Chicana women who are taking positive action to bring the purposes of the NWPC as drafted in July 1971 to fruition. So, and that it be it resolved that the caucus endorses a FARA boycott. And as it turns out, to go back to this wonderful and exciting picture, anyone in Houston who knows the old Josky's department store, this was the picket outside of the Josky's department store, and both Sissy and Ruth were there and participated in it.
And I want to be mindful of time,
Yeah,
because
where are
we
we on
did
that?
get a late start and all, but I don't think
It's
they're going to hold the
3:25.
closing plenary for us. So
Why don't I go through a few
so
more
I
things,
think
then let's
we have
come
about
back.
5
Yeah.
minutes
Okay.
left, and would like to get some questions from the floor too.
Right.
So do you want to just finish?
Yeah, I want to finish a couple of other things that I think kind of speak to this issue. So we see with this resolution that you are having the caucuses and the workshops really pushing the organization to adhere to this statement of purpose. Also, I want to run through these quickly because I think they really speak to the attempt to try to implement or create an organization that in principle focused on these core issues. The Puerto Rican Women's Caucus, in addition to talking about bilingual education and bicultural education, which was also raised by the Chicana Caucus, the Puerto Rican Women's Caucus also wanted adequate representation because they felt that, that was crucial in order to have an effective voice in the NWPC. But to me, the sharpest statement, and it was less a resolution and more, here's the state of things, came from the Black Caucus, which simply said, Black feminists face enormous difficulties in recruiting Black women to feminism because of a series of complex sociological and political reasons. The NWPC has often taken admirably principled positions on issues that concern us. Issues such as the ERA are vital to Black women, but so are the guaranteed annual income and budgetary cuts in national social service programs. The caucus urgently needs to demonstrate concrete concern for issues that fall disproportionately on poor and minority women of color. So I think that kind of sets up maybe some more comments about this, and then we can open up for questions.
This is really too bad that we don't have more
Yeah,
time,
we
because
need to.
both Ruth and Sissy did march in the picket of FARA, and it wasn't something that everybody agreed on. But I think with what Susan just ended with those the resolutions, I mean, one of the things that happened with the caucus, at least in the years that you were chair, Sissy, is you said you really spent an inordinate amount of time on the ERA, and weren't able to pursue maybe some of those other issues in the way that you might have liked, although you did in a way because of who was interested in the ERA. So could you talk a little bit?
No, just that, but I do want to put a footnote to the Farah strike because I made the comment because as soon as I got home that evening, the telephone started ringing. And it was people, relatives and friends who'd supported me saying, "What are you doing down there?" Out of that came a comment I said that it's a lot quieter to sign a petition in the New York Times than it is to march in front of Josky's in Houston. And I only tell you this story to tell you the atmosphere of where we were meeting. We could not find anyone that would host a fundraiser for the caucus. We finally went, we had permission to use the faculty club at Rice University. So, you know, we're reading all these resolutions and so, but you were in an alien atmosphere.
Oh, yes.
To the point that the Texas caucus advised me not to take the position, not to run for the position because of the hostility toward the caucus. Now, we'll move forward to the ERA.
And when we were marching, I remember reading about what happened to Mexicans in Texas jails. I didn't want to go to jail, but I cared enough to support the strikers.
And I think one of the things on the ERA was it looked feasible in the beginning. And you asked me about that yesterday, and I think that was the reason there was this huge push. The first place I went after being elected was to Nevada, to Las Vegas, where testifying was being given before Senate committee, state Senate committee. And that's when I had my first concern about what was going to happen, because they had first a person that supported it and then the one that didn't. And I saw the strength of the Mormon church and the testifying of the woman. And the woman that testified just before I spoke had 2 daughters. And she literally said, I've never forgotten it, she said, I would rather have my 2 daughters dead than live under the Equal Rights Amendment. And this is what we were facing. We had lived in a bubble for what was really going on outside. There it is. That's
Unforgettable
ERA.
times. Unforgettable times.
Yeah. And let me just interject one thing, because there's something very conspicuous that transpired in '72 we have not taken into consideration, and that was the vote for the 18-year-old.
Oh, yes, yes.
The vote for the 18-year-old.
Voting
Oh,
age.
yeah.
I know in my own experience, it played an enormous role, probably more than women, you know, if you had to measure things.
Well, on that provocative note, are there any young people out here?
No.
Under 18? No, over 18.
No.
But can we take 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think we should ask questions.
So why don't we just take 5 minutes? I know you all wanted to move the microphone down. Who's on the mic? Yes?
Or if there are any questions, if you could stand up and speak loudly, which I'm sure you all can.
Or what about this here?
Okay.
Yeah.
What about one of these?
Okay.
Well, here she is. Go ahead.
So you can just come up to this microphone. Come on up. Thank you. And why don't we just take a couple of questions from the floor and then give you all a chance for last response.
I'm from San Francisco, Jennifer Wilson. I assume the caucus no longer exists. And I don't know, does it?
Does.
And
it's still
if
around, yeah.
if it does still exist, why can't we make it work?
Do you want to, are you going to
Martha?
answer or? Okay. Can you?
The caucus does exist. And in Texas, we have pretty much of an inactive caucus. However, every time it gets active, I'm a member. And I've been a member. I consider the 1971 an organizational meeting. I consider the real funding or founding of the caucus to be 1973, where thousands of women got together from all over the nation. So I've always going around, and that's why Linda did we're responsible for her doing the Mujeres de las Caucus because I think the founding was actually 73. In 72, we started to organize the state caucuses. So the state, am I correct?
Yeah.
Right. So, and those people throughout the nation that founded their state caucus, including the Raza Unida Caucus and other Chicanas in the Republican and Democratic Party, were founding members. So I say, you're all founding members. The caucus exists. However, we don't hold our presidential candidates responsible for supporting women's programs. And Hillary, if I don't think I'm mistaken that she was a member of the caucus at one point. I mean, I remember her hanging around us, you know, in DC, getting into trouble with us. And yet, I bet you we're not going to hold her responsible for women's programs like Jimmy Carter instituted and Ford continued. We are really lax about putting those responsibilities on our candidates. I just want to say something about coalitions. Those of you that will be involved with a caucus or with establishing national women's organizations, the disappointing thing about the caucus is we got excited about the provision for coalitions, and we thought that along with state caucuses, lesbian women wanted a coalition, minority women wanted coalitions, you know, along their interest line because we had a lot of work to do. Yet we could then coalesce on state and national issues. So don't forget coalitions because that's where your strength is. Had the caucus proceeded on interest coalitions, I believe we would still have a strong and viable representative body to, you know, represent us before our government. As it is, we don't have anything that I know of that represents us. Thank you. But the caucus exists. You can become a member. I'm a member.
Yeah, well, one of the things about, I mean, Susan and I were talking about was this coalition. Our first thought was this is intersectionality, right? When we saw the statement, but that didn't happen until the 80s, that it got accepted as a term, right? So one of the things that is striking is the coalition building, and I think, and around, it's not just so women's issues were not distinct from issues of race, issues of class, issues of war, I mean, from what we saw in the statement.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to follow up that. I'm Marilyn Blackwell, and I wanted to ask you about your experiences at the 1977 Houston Convention and what happened with the Republican women who were in the caucus. I'm assuming that, Ruth, you were there for International Women's Year Conference in 1977. Is that, am I incorrect? Okay.
I was still,
Yeah.
I was re-elected first part.
Yeah. And then the alternative caucus that was being held across the city, run by Phyllis Schlafly. And how did the Republican women respond at that point within the caucus?
Thank you so much. That's great.
Did you all want to?
Oh, were you going to comment on?
I said, I don't remember Boston as much as I remember the first one.
Oh, Houston.
Houston.
Okay.
I mean, Houston.
Houston, okay. And Sissy, I know Sissy wasn't there.
National Advisory Meeting. That's the one where you were on the
Yes.
National Advisory.
Right.
I'm
Well,
being a
that's
very
our
bad
thing.
chair.
That's what Linda told me, and we talked about that, that you were on the National
I
Advisory.
was on
and
that national advisory of what?
the International Women's Year, sorry. And you attended.
International Women's Year.
77, Houston.
Okay, all right. Well,
I'm
I
happy.
know we're going to have to close out in a few minutes, but I did want to say something about that, and this is kind of a part of a conversation I've had with Karen and Sissy for a while. So I was also at the International Women's Year, but I wasn't in there. People, and this is, you know, a classic example of why we wanted to have this panel, which is to get, you know, history told that no one really knows about and hasn't been recorded. So as a very, very young woman, that's my joke about way to the left of Karen, I protested outside the IWY in 1977, not because I was with Phyllis Schlafly, but it hasn't been recorded that there was an alternative to the IWY convention that was held and organized by radical women of color and by radical women, period. One of the groups was a Boston Health Collective, and I don't know if that group is still around, but they were there along with labor women, along with Latinas and African Americans, who felt that the issues that were presented at the IWY were issues for a privileged class of women, but not, you know, the majority of women. And that was the whole point of having an alternative conference. Well, as you know, as history is recorded, we remember that Schlafly was there, but nobody has really written the book or done the work around the alternative one. And part of why the statement of purpose appealed to me is because some of those issues were indeed the very issues we were talking about, but even taking reproductive health a step further. And I guess I'll leave you with the joke that we'll have to use as the in-house women's joke, and then I'll give this to my friend. One of the things that happened there is that the Boston Health Collective really wanted to teach women how to be able to handle and work, you know, how to understand their bodies. So, I mean, some of these things you think to yourself sound very touchy-feely, but in addition to the political issues, it was also a question of just understanding that health is a political issue, who gets health care and who doesn't. So this conference really tried to push the envelope on understanding what it meant to connect all these things, race, class, gender, and, you know, the need to organize. So in the interest of history, one day someone here, I hope, will write that book about, if it's not me, okay, will write that story about the other alternative to the International Women's Year. So let me give it to Ruth and, yes, ma'am?
The second
Oh, we
election
gotta
of
cut
the
it.
NWPC was in Boston, because that's where
right.
That was
Audrey was
70.
elected president, and I was reelected
75.
vice.
That's right, in 1975. Well, listen, we are over time, so I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank Ruth and Sissy. This has been wonderful.
And now run to the closing.
We don't get a chance to say goodbye.
Oh, I know.
And
It's just great
if
seeing you.
we don't meet hand by hand and stand the heat.
No, I think it's done 7. I'm just going to finish breaking this up.